Hi guys, welcome to the discussion of forensic medicine recall questions of FMG August 2020 session. Right? I know the last session was little unconventional, the questions were little unexpected. But if you see the forensic medicine questions, FMT questions, most of it were level 1 and level 2 questions. If you have listened to the lectures properly, you should have been in a position to answer almost all the questions. Right? So whatever may be the pattern of questions, the concepts always remain the same. So work upon the concepts, you can crack any exam, whichever is there. Right? So let us start with the discussion. When the victim is dying because of unlawful act, the police recorded dying declaration. Right? The doctor certifies that the victim was conscious and mentally oriented. And under what circumstance the dying declaration is invalid. Right? So they're asking you in what circumstances it is invalid. 4 options are given. If the victim is not dead, victim did not sign the declaration, declarant is not expecting the death, it is done by the doctor. Okay, so what is the correct answer? The correct answer would be if the victim is not dead. Right. So let us have a small discussion on dying declaration. This is very important topic. Time and again the questions are being targeted very commonly on this area. Right. Dying declaration. Okay, this is given by the section 32(1) Indian Evidence Act. Right. This is about Indian Evidence Act, not IPC. 5 important questions. If you are able to answer these 5 questions, then you are good to go for this dying declaration. What is it basically? What is dying declaration? This is a document. This is a document made on the statement given by the dying victim. Right? The dying victim is going to give a statement and you're going to record it. On what? Related to the circumstances of unnatural act. It is not related to the will, because most of the times students tend to remember that it is about the property, it is about the will. No, it is not about the property, it is related to the circumstance around the unnatural event. It can be an accident, it can be an homicide, it can be suicide, right? So if it is unnatural act, right, the circumstances, this document is mainly related to the circumstances around unnatural event. Who's going to record it? The second question. Who's going to record? Who can record? We can say who can record. Remember, as per law, anyone can record. There is no restriction on that. If it is feasible, it is ideally recorded by the magistrate. Ideally, if magistrate is not available, doctor is not available, police. If police is also not available, any common public can record. Okay. So the only condition is you need to record it in the presence of 2 witnesses. That is more important. Okay. And there is one more important criteria. While you are starting the dying declaration and throughout the dying declaration, what is the role of a doctor? The role of a doctor is to certify whether the person is in compos mentis or not. You can ask me, sir, what is compos mentis? Compos mentis, this is sound mind, clear mind. The person is in sound mind, right? Only when the person is in sound mind, you can start recording dying declaration. This is a kind of evidence. If the person is not in sound mind, you cannot take the declaration or evidence, right? So the person should be in, the patient victim should be in sound mind. Okay. How is it recorded? What is the procedure for recording this dying declaration? The first thing is, as I told you, you need to certify. You need to make sure the victim is in sound mind. While you are recording dying declaration, there is no oath administered. You should not take, you need not take any oath. Leading questions are not permitted, right? You can't ask any leading question. Suppose if you have any doubt regarding the fact given by the person, you can ask a question and the answer is given by the victim. So you need to record both the question and the answer in the declaration itself. It should not be a leading question, right? It should not be a leading question. And remember, whatever the victim is telling, it has to be recorded verbatim, word by word. It has to be recorded verbatim, right? You cannot change the statement or the sentences given by the victim. Okay. Once it is done, once the declaration is complete, it has to be signed by the person who records. We can say he is a recorder. The doctor should sign and the 2 witnesses should also sign. Okay, so these are the people who should sign, and after the completion of dying declaration, it has to be forwarded to the executive magistrate, nearby magistrate. Fine. What if the victim dies in between? You're recording the dying declaration and the person dies in the middle of the recording itself. Is that dying declaration invalid? No. Even if it is incomplete, the particular recording, the statement, whatever statement is given by the victim till that point, it is valid. Right? That is one very important point which you need to remember. Okay. Now comes the point, under what circumstance the dying declaration happens to be invalid. Under what circumstance it's invalid? That is a question actually. Right? The first thing, if the victim is not in sound mind, while you are recording, if the victim is not in sound mind, then this dying declaration is not valid. Okay? Other than that, if the victim survives, right, after giving dying declaration, if the victim survives, then this declaration is invalid. He has to appear to the court of law, he need to depose by himself, and this statement, this particular document will be used as corroborative evidence, supportive evidence, right? As such, that particular document will be used only as supportive evidence, nothing else. That's why remember, there are only two situations where it is invalid. One, if the victim survives. Two, if the person is not in sound mind. If the person is disoriented or not conscious, then that document will be invalid. Right. Now, having spoken about dying declaration, I should also mention about one more important procedure, that is nothing but your dying deposition. Right? Dying deposition. Very, very important. Remember the term deposition. Okay, underline depose. Depose means giving evidence. Right? The person is giving evidence at the time of dying. So when you are giving evidence, proper evidence, what are the personnel should be available? Magistrate should be available. So in this case, only magistrate can record. Only magistrate can record. Okay, very important point. Not only that, the accused or his lawyer will be present during the recording of dying deposition. When this defense lawyer is present, he will cross-examine the victim. Right? Remember, cross-examination is done at the time of this dying deposition. And you know very well, at the time of, during the procedure of cross-examination, which questions are permitted? Leading questions are permitted. Right? Leading questions are permitted. Now, so this is the whole procedure about dying deposition, and you know, this is practiced in some of the states of US. Right? Now, let us compare both dying declaration and dying deposition. Dying declaration and dying deposition. Which is superior? What do you think? Which is superior? Remember, dying deposition is superior than dying declaration. Fine? Dying deposition is superior. Make a note of this, friend. This is very, very important. But in India, dying deposition procedure is being practiced. Right? We don't have dying deposition. We have dying declaration. Dying declaration is being practiced in India. Right? Fine. So this is about dying declaration and deposition. As they have targeted dying declaration now, we can expect questions on dying deposition as well, the subsequent exams. Okay, so we need to be familiar with all these concepts. Let's move on to the next question. Identify the type of fingerprint. See, so far you would have been seeing one-liners. They would have given the question as which is the most common type of fingerprint. Right? There were 4 options would have been given and you need to choose one. But now they have given you the image. You need to identify what pattern it is. Fine? I'll tell you easy way to identify the pattern. There are only 4 patterns which you need to know for examination purpose. I'll tell you easy way to remember. First, look at the image given in the picture. Right? If you look at the image, just follow the lines. Each line is called a ridge. Right? Follow the pattern of ridge. If you follow the ridge goes to the top. It makes a loop and comes back to the same side. It starts on one side, goes to the top, comes back to the same side. This pattern is called as loop. Right? It is looping. Right? Goes top, comes back to the same. This is called loop. Fine. Let's discuss about that. What are the other patterns? Fine. See, the pattern of fingerprinting, the classification was basically done by a person called Galton. Right? We follow Galton's system of fingerprinting. This is very important. Right? And What is this study called as? This study is called as dactylography, right? Make a note of this. This is a very easy one, dactylography, right? And you know very well, the world's first fingerprint bureau was established at Kolkata in 1897. World's first, right? More than a century old. And if you see dactylography as such, right, this is the most absolute method of identification. You know why? The fingerprinting, it is the most absolute method of identification. Most absolute method. You can ask me, sir, which is superior, DNA fingerprinting or it is dactylography fingerprinting, right? Which is superior? Dactylography is superior to DNA fingerprinting. You can ask me why? Because this dactylography, the fingerprints, they are not inherited. That means parents and kids will not have same fingerprints. And remember, if you take monozygotic twins, the DNA pattern would be same, but still the fingerprint would be different. Okay, so that is why this dactylography, it is very useful in differentiating the twins as well, right? And that is why I told you this is the most absolute method of identification, right? I was telling you about the 4 common patterns. What are the 4 common patterns we need to learn? The first one is loop. The second one is whorls. The third one is arch. And the last one is composite. Loops, whorls, arch and composite. These are the 4 patterns we need to know. And I have written in the order that, you can just see that it is in the descending order. The most common pattern is your loop. The least common pattern is your composite. This again can be an important MCQ. They can ask you which is the most common pattern. You need to say it is loop. They can ask you which is least common pattern, that is composite. Okay, fine. Then how to differentiate the patterns, loop, whorls, arch or composite? Let's discuss here. See, just look at the first one. The ridge starts from one side. The ridge starts from one side. It goes to the top and moves on to the opposite side. When it moves on to the opposite side, it is called arch, right? It's called arch. Fine. Okay. And again, you have 2 types of arches. One is tinted arch, plain arch. Okay. For now, you just know what are the 4 patterns. That is more than sufficient for now. Okay. Coming to the loop, you can see the ridge starts from one side. The ridge starts from one side. It goes to the top. It returns to the normal. It returns to the same side itself. It starts from one side, goes to the top, returns back to the same side. That is called loop. And if it forms concentric circles, you can notice the concentric circles here. That is called whorls. Right? Easy to remember. If the finger shows multiple patterns, composite pattern, you can call it as composite. It's very simple. Right? Arch, loop and whorls. Fine. And if it undifferentiated, you can say it is composite. And the most common, remember, loop, and the least common is composite. Okay, these are the 4 different patterns. Depending on the type of fingerprint in the scene of crime, we have few types. The first one is called as visible fingerprint, wherein you can just see the fingerprint itself. The person must have touched the colored substance, dye, or he must have touched the blood and he must have touched the surface. You can see the pattern itself. That is called visible fingerprint. You can just see it. Sometimes it may not be visible. You need to develop, right? By applying some developing powders, you need to develop it. That is called latent fingerprint, which is not normally visible, right? The third one is called plastic fingerprint, wherein the person must have touched a molten substance like a wax, right? If you touch the wax, you can see the cast of the fingerprint and the wax itself. That is called plastic fingerprint. Okay, so these are 3 different types available in the scene of crime. Okay, now if you see the whole pattern in the scene of crime, if you're able to recover the whole pattern, you can use this dactylography. Sometimes the whole fingerprint might not be recovered in the scene of crime. You can just recover a fragment of fingerprint, right? A partial fragment will be available, and if you find some partial fragment, you can use another study that is called poroscopy. That's called poroscopy. You need to underline the word pores, right? This is basically the study of sweat pores in between the fingerprint ridges. If you see two ridges in between the fingerprint, you can see opening of sweat pores, right? The size, the shape, the arrangement, it is unique to each individual, right? You use that for identifying a person. This is called poroscopy. And again, just make a note of this. This is not sebaceous pores. This is sweat gland, opening of sweat glands. Very important, right? And they can ask you who invented this study. Remember, Locard. Locard's poroscopy. Okay, this was again one of the repeat questions. Locard's poroscopy. Fine. Okay, moving on to the next one. A dead body with a wound on the neck with clean cut edges, okay, but crushed tissues with vertebral portions disrupted. Okay, edges are sharp, but still the underlying tissues are crushed, so it might be heavier. They ask you what type of wound it is, whether it is cut wound, whether it's chop wound, laceration or avulsion. Okay, laceration, avulsion, they are not possible because they have given clean cut edges. They're not possible. Okay, they have given you cut wound. Again, cut wound is not possible. That option is also ruled out because they are in the question crushed tissues are mentioned. Okay, so incised wound is also not possible. The only option which is possible is your chop wound. Okay, so the answer for this is chop wound, right? You can ask me, sir, why can't it be an incised looking laceration, right? Even in incised looking laceration, the margins will be sharp, but underlying tissues might be crushed. Remember, that is why they've given you the site in the question. Had they given you scalp, okay, or forehead, iliac crest, pretibial region, then you can think of incised looking laceration. They have given you the neck. It is not a bony prominence. For incised looking laceration to appear, you need bony prominence, right? Where the tissues, skin, right, is very close to the bone. The subcutaneous tissues are very scanty. In other words, it's a bony prominence, right? Neck is not a bony prominence. So incised looking laceration, that option is ruled out. The best available option is chop wound. Okay, let me give you the classification of mechanical injury. We have already seen it. Okay, but I'm just going to refresh your memory. See, blunt force and sharp force, two forces are there. When we say blunt force, 3 injuries are possible. It can be an abrasion. It's only a scratch. Okay, it's only a scratch. It can be a contusion. Okay, what is contusion? Contusion is because of the blunt force under the skin, the vessels are ruptured. It results in bleeding. So the skin might be normal, but the blood is getting collected underneath. This is called contusion. This is also called as bruise. Okay, so it can be a bruise or contusion. The third blunt force injury is laceration. The skin is totally torn. Okay, so there are only 3 important injuries. Just make a note of it. And regarding sharp force, if it is light cutting weapon, can you tell me an example of light cutting weapon? Surgical blade, light cutting weapon, it can produce incised wound. Okay, chop wound. Chop wound is produced by a heavy cutting weapon like axe, meat chopper. The margin might be sharp, but it is heavy weapon. If it is heavy cutting weapon, it will produce chop. Fine. And stab wound. Stab wound is produced by different kind of force. That is nothing but your pointed force. Any weapon with a pointed end, it can cause stab wound. Okay, so just remember, these are 3 main important injuries available. I'll just show you the picture of each injury. Just try to identify it. This is only an injury to the epidermis, right? This is only a scratch. So what should it be? It is abrasion. Okay, abrasion is of 4 types. You know that very well. It can be a scratch abrasion, it can be a grazed abrasion, it can be a pressure abrasion, or it can also be a patterned abrasion. So remember, there are 4 types of abrasions so far. This is another example of an abrasion. You can see the scratch. It is only the epidermis of the skin is being destroyed. Here in this injury, you can see some discolored areas. Skin is normal, but you can see discolored. Why is it discolored? That is because you have blood is getting collected under the skin, blood accumulation, blood collection under the skin. When you have blood collection under the skin, what do you call this as? Remember, this is called bruise. It's also called as contusion. Okay, this is also called as contusion. You have various types. You have ectopic bruise, you have pattern bruise, okay, superficial bruise, deep bruise. So many types are there. For now, you remember this is your blood collection producing contusion. This is another picture of contusion. Okay, what is this? This is laceration. Okay, remember this is the third important blunt force injury. This is laceration. Okay. Now tell me, what are the features of laceration? How do you identify a laceration? The first and most important point is irregular margin. Right? This is very, very important. The margins might be irregular. Right? And edges are contused. If you look at the flow, remember, if you look at the floor, all the structures, when I say all the structures, what are the structures? You can have hair follicle, you can have nerve fibers, you can have vessels, everything would have been crushed. That is because of the blunt force. And there is one more very important point which you need to remember. In a case of laceration, you normally find tissue bridges, right? Tissue tags connecting both edges. So these are tissue bridges. So this is the classical appearance of a laceration, right? Let us compare it with an incised wound. This is an incised wound. When you look at the incised wound, you can note that the margins are clean cuts. Margins are clean cuts. Okay. And you need to look at the floor. When you examine the floor, remember all the structures are cut. It's not crushed, it is cut. Underline the point, it is cut. And you will not find any kind of tissue bridges here. That is the most important difference between a laceration and incised wound. And now can you tell me which will bleed more? Is it laceration or incised wound? Remember friends, always the incised wound you will find more bleeding. Because of the cut vessels, the bleeding hemorrhage will be more with regard to incised wound, not with laceration. Okay, you can see this is another image of incised wound. And when you are looking at an incised wound, let us say this is an incised wound, okay, you will find something like this at the end. The most superficial part of the incised wound, the most superficial part of the incised wound. If you see this incised wound, let us name it as head end and tail end. Let us mark head end and tail end. When you have head end will usually be deeper. And tail end will be the most superficial part. In this most superficial part, if you look at this particular part, only the skin will be cut, nothing else will be cut. And remember, this particular feature is called as tailing. Right? This is called tailing. Very important part. Okay? The reason is this particular tailing will help you to find out the direction of force, from which direction started and which direction is ending, terminated, right? So remember tailing. Moving on, this is a stab wound, okay? And I just want to tell you the other synonyms of incised wound. Instead of incised wound, they can give you cut wound. They can give you slash. They can give you slicing injuries. Okay, don't get surprised in the exam. All these are synonyms. Okay, cut, slice, slash, everything is same. Okay, what you're looking at is nothing but your stab injury. Remember friends, this is stab injury produced by pointed weapon. Okay, and what you're looking at, the image is showing you penetrating wound. And when you're looking at the stab injury, you must know there are three important terminologies. One is punctured wound. The next one is penetrating. Right? And the last one is perforating. What is punctured, what is penetrating, and what is perforating? Punctured whenever the stab injury enters into the tissues, we call it as punctured. When the stab injury enters into the cavity, right, it has got only entry. I told you it enters the cavity, it does not exit, right? When it enters the cavity, it is penetrating. When it enters and exits the cavity, enters and exits the cavity, that is perforating wound. So remember, punctured, penetrating and perforating. And you are looking at another stab injury, punctured. You can see the typical weapon, what kind of weapon it is. You can see the axe. Note the two important points. The first thing is the sharp edges. Second one is the heaviness of the weapon. Right? When such kind of weapon is used as a weapon of violence, it will result in chop. Right? It results in chop. Most commonly, these chop wounds are gaping, wide gaping wound. You can see a big gaping wound. Okay? And margins might be clean, but underlying tissues would be crushed. And there's one more point you need to know. We call it as beveling. Beveling is also one of the important feature of chop. Though it is seen with other incised wound as well, in chop injury, beveling is very, very commonly seen. You can ask me, sir, what is beveling? Beveling is like when there is an oblique cut is given. Oblique. When there is oblique cut is given, oblique force is given, it will produce something like this. Okay? Oblique. One edge will be undermining, another edge will be on the top, overlapping. Okay, this is called beveling, which is also very commonly seen with chop. And in most of the chop injuries, you can see the fracture of underlying bones as well. Suppose if there is a chop injury in your head, right, you will definitely see the fracture of the skull vault. Okay, most of the time you can find the fracture of the underlying bone. That is what is being given in the question, under the fracture of the vertebral bones. Okay, fine. Let's move further. A 14-year-old girl was kidnapped by a male. While the police arrested him, he died in the police custody. The question is very, very simple, friends. It's very, very simple. The accused, the person, it's a case of custodial death. As simple as that. And they want you to tell the inquest is conducted by judicial magistrate. It's so simple. It's one of the very commonly repeated question. Okay. There should not be any difficulty with that. Let us revise something about inquest. You know, inquest is nothing but inquiry into the cause of death, unnatural death. So we have two types of inquest in India. I hope you remember that. As we have discussed in the class, you must be remembering there are two types of inquest. One is police inquest, another one is magistrate inquest. Right? Police and magistrate. You need to tell me which is more common and which is less common. Most common is police inquest. But remember, friends, the superior inquest is your magistrate inquest. Okay, superior is magistrate inquest. I told you to remember 174 CRPC and 176 CRPC, which is superior magistrate inquest. So you need to give 176 CRPC to magistrate, 174 CRPC to police. It is CRPC, not IPC. Okay, coming to the police inquest, who can be the inquest officer? What is the minimum rank for a person, for a police to become a inquest officer? It is senior head constable. Okay, senior head constable or head constable. A police constable cannot be an inquest officer in police inquest. The inquest officer will go to the scene of crime. He will inquire along with the witnesses. Okay, he will prepare a report that is called Panchanama. Okay, this Panchanama is an inquiry report that will be forwarded to the magistrate at the end of inquiry. Okay. Now coming to the magistrate inquest, this is the point of discussion now. Under what circumstances that magistrate inquest is commonly done? Okay. Now let me give you one important mnemonic for this. As I have told in the lectures as well, A, B, C, D, E. A for asylum, psychiatric hospitals, death occurring in psychiatric hospitals. B for Bostels. You know what is a Bostel? Bostel is a remand home, child reformatory school. Okay, juvenile home, Bostels. C for custodial death, and remember it is not only custodial death but also custodial rape. D for dowry death. E for exhumation. Remember, these are the 5 situations where the magistrate inquest is being done. This is easy to remember. Now the point is, when you're talking about magistrate inquest, there are 2 types of magistrate available. One is judicial magistrate, another one is executive magistrate. As we discussed earlier, a judicial magistrate is a person sitting in the court of law who conducts trial. Executive magistrate, they are government officials basically. They are appointed by the government like collector, tahsildar, RDO, okay. They'll be appointed in the post of district magistrate, subdivisional magistrate, like that. Now, what is the role of this judicial magistrate and executive magistrate? When you're talking about custodial death, all these 3 things will be considered as custodial death, right? That means death occurring in the custody, okay? Authorized custody means it is not only the police, even if the person is under the custody of court, even if the person is under the custody of government, it is called as custodial death. What are the things that are coming under custodial death? Death occurring in psychiatric hospitals, death occurring in hostels, child reformatory schools, juvenile homes, death occurring in lockup deaths, encounter deaths, police shooting, okay. All these will be considered as custodial death. And remember, in case of custodial death, the only person who can do inquest is judicial magistrate. Executive magistrate is not empowered to do inquest in custodial death. This is highly important. Make a note of this, okay. Only judicial magistrate can do inquest in custodial death. Then what is the role of executive magistrate? Executive magistrate can do inquest in 2 situations. One is suspected dowry death, another one is exhumation. Only these 2 situations wherein the executive magistrate, they have a role to play, okay. So remember this is very important. We can expect questions in the subsequent exam on the same area, okay. Moving on to the next question. A man was admitted in the casualty with the following sign. The image is given. It is nothing but bilateral ptosis. Fine. His friends saw him lying on the ground and they also saw a snake passing in that area. They took a photograph of it and they brought the patient to the hospital, not the snake. They brought the patient to the hospital. They're asking, the patient died in the hospital and what is the cause of death? Look at the photograph of the snake. The snake is identified as crate. Okay, so simple. It's very simple. It's crate and you see ptosis. And what is the probable cause of death? The probable cause of death is neuroparalysis of, that is respiratory paralysis. The person died of respiratory paralysis. Very important point. As we have discussed earlier, just remember the identification of snake. This is very important to identify the snake, because for the past few sessions you take AIIMS, you take FMG, you take JIPMER, right? Whatever may be the session, for the past few sessions, most of the questions are being targeted on ophiology. What is ophiology? The study of snakes, right? So you need to learn the identification of snake and you need to know the management of snake bitten patient, right? Including the treatment and the investigation. Fine. Let us see how to identify. So what you're looking at is the Russell's viper. How to identify Russell's viper? You can easily identify with the presence of diamond-shaped markings. Diamond-shaped markings on the back of snake. 3 rows will be there, 1 on the top, 2 on the side. Not only that, if you can see the head of the snake, you can see it will be triangular. Okay, triangular head and diamond-shaped marking. Your diagnosis is very simple. It can be easily identified as Russell's viper. Sometimes in the exam, if they want to confuse you, instead of giving Russell's viper directly, they might give you the scientific name of the snake is W. russellii. Okay, and what is a snake? You can see the snake forming a hood
On the back of the hood, if you can see the spectacle mark, right? If you can see the spectacle mark, that is common cobra. If you are not able to see the spectacle mark, that should be king cobra. That should be king cobra. Common cobra, naja naja, and king cobra, Ophiophagus. So it is going to eat the snake. Ophiophagus anna, right? And this is king cobra. King cobra, it won't have any spectacle mark. And this is common krait. Okay, the common krait, extremely venomous snake. You can see on the dorsum of the snake, this is the place where you can see hexagonal scales. Hexagonal scales will be there. Okay, on the dorsum of snake, you can see the hexagonal scales here. And apart from that, in the krait, the infralabial scale, the fourth infralabial scale will be the largest. They can target this in the next exam. Fourth infralabial scale being the largest. When you talk about cobra, the third supralabial scale will be the largest. Okay, for cobra it is third, and krait it is fourth infralabial. Okay, this is saw scale viper. You can see the saw scale viper, normally it coils around itself. If you see the edges of the body, some serrations will be there, which is used to cause a rustling sound. And in the head, you can see the arrow mark as well. Okay, so all these features indicate that it is a saw scale viper. You're talking about these snakes because these snakes are most important with regard to Indian scenario. And when they ask you what is the treatment, you can give treatment that is nothing ASV. You can give ASV, anti-snake venom. And if you take elapid, let's see something about the family elapids. When you talk about elapids, we have king cobra, common cobra, and krait. So these are neurotoxic. They are predominantly neurotoxic. If you take viperidae, vipers, Russell's viper, saw scale viper, pit viper, all vipers, these vipers are basically vascular toxic. You can as well call it as hemotoxic. Vascular toxic or hemotoxic. And the last one is sea snake, that is Hydropidae. These sea snakes are myotoxic. Okay, so that is why renal failure is very common with regard to sea snake, myotoxic, rhabdomyolysis. Fine. So krait is neurotoxic. That is why we have chosen the option neuroparalysis. In autopsy, the doctor tied the bronchus and checking the floating and sinking of the lung. He is just checking whether the lung is floating or not. This lung is floating or not, this test is called lung flotation test. You know it very well. What is this lung flotation test? What is the synonym of lung flotation test, friends? This is nothing but your hydrostatic test. You're going to check whether the lung is floating or not, right? And remember, there is one more name for this hydrostatic test. It is Raygaard's test. This is to check the lung flotation. What are the other tests we need to know? We have Fodder's test. Fodder's, this is based on the weight of the lung. So remember, the weight of the lung, when the baby respires, the weight will be doubled. We have one more test that is called Ploquet's test. This test is based on the ratio of lung weight by the whole weight, baby weight. Okay, so the ratio will differ. 1.70 will become 1.35. Okay, this is called Ploquet's test. Then we have Redden's test. Redden's test, we are checking the middle ear. What are we checking in the middle ear, friends? We are checking gelatin. Okay, gelatin tissue. When the baby starts respiring, the gelatinous tissue will be cleared off. If not, baby has not respired. If the baby is not respired, you can see the presence of gelatinous tissue in the middle ear. Moving on further, the last test we need to learn is breast loss second life test. This is also called as stomach bowel test. Here what are we checking, friends? Here we are checking whether the stomach is floating or not. Okay, just learn the names of this: hydrostatic test, Fortas test, Blockage test, Redens test, and breast loss second life test. Very, very important. Answer for this: hydrostatic test, lung flotation. A patient was brought to the OPD with greenish color skin. That is a clue. Greenish color skin with rotten egg smell. It's so simple. The answer, it is your hydrogen sulfide. Okay. So many times time and again I have told you in the during the lectures, hypostasis and poisoning and smell and poisoning, they are high yield areas. Okay. Let us revise the smell. Cyanide. What is the smell of cyanide? It is bitter almond smell. Cannabis, it is burnt rope. Thallium, arsenic and phosphorus tap poisons, they are garlic. Zinc phosphide, it is fishy. Chloral hydrate, peraldehyde, it is acrid pure. And hydrogen sulfide, last but not least, hydrogen sulfide, it is got rotten egg smell. Very important to learn. Okay. Apart from these are the basic information. I'll tell you some extra information which you need to know to answer more higher difficulty questions. Nitrobenzene, shoe polish smell. What is the smell of conium maculatum? Conium maculatum, it's a peripheral nerve poison, friends, also called as hemlock. It has got carrot-like smell. And what is the smell of alcohol? You know that it has got fruity odor, right? And if they ask you what is the smell of naphthalene, naphthalene has got mothball smell. Okay. So these are the smells which we need to know. A man continues to call the females, achieves sexual gratification by talking obscene and sharing obscene pictures. Okay. Talking obscenity and achieving sexual gratification, this is called telephone scatologia. This is very important. Even if you know you don't know the exact words termed during the exam, if you have known the remaining terminologies, you could have easily excluded this option. Okay. Sometimes we have to choose, sometimes we have to exclude. Okay. Choose the right answer and exclude the wrong answers. Fine. Let us see what is scotophilia. Scotophilia is the synonym of peeping Tom. What is peeping Tom again? This is another synonym of voyeurism itself, right? The person achieves sexual gratification by watching the private acts of a female. That is called voyeurism, peeping Tom. Okay, that is voyeurism. Stalking, following a female, okay, without consent, of course. That is stalking. Not only in person, to social media, okay, digital format, everything is stalking. I'll tell you another important point. Voyeurism is punishable under dash section. Okay, this voyeurism is punishable under 354C IPC. Okay, 354C. Stalking is punishable under 354D IPC. Remember this. 354C and 354D potential MCQs. A chronic alcoholic starts experiencing visual hallucinations, talking irrelevant, disoriented. The patient is having clouding of consciousness, disorientation is there, tremors there after 48 hours. Okay, after 48 hours, that is an important keyword. After 48 hours of stopping alcohol withdrawal. After the cessation of alcohol, after 48 hours of cessation of alcohol, the person develops clouding of consciousness, disorientation, tremors, visual hallucination. These are typical of delirium tremens. Okay, these are typical of delirium tremens. The alcoholic hallucinosis, they occur, usually they occur little earlier, okay, 12 to 36 hours. Okay, since they have particularly mentioned 48 hours and they have mentioned disorientation, so the best answer for this question would be delirium tremens. And if any person commits a crime during the phase of delirium tremens, okay, the person is not responsible. It's very common fact. Everybody would have known. But under what section? The person is not responsible under 84, 85, 86 IPC. Which is under which section the person is not responsible? Remember, when a person is under delirium tremens, if he has committed crime, he is not responsible under the section 84 IPC. Very, 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 very important. Not 85 or 86. It is 84 IPC because the person is under temporary insanity. Okay, you know very well 84 IPC is related to criminal response of insane person. So that is an ideal section which is related to this particular condition, delirium tremens. Okay, make a note of this. Identify this abuse. Is it bagging, sniffing? This is a question about inhalant abuse. Last year it was asked and again they have repeated the same question, same area. Bagging, sniffing, huffing and snorting. What is it? So since the person is having a bag and it is inhaling from it, it is very simple. The answer would be bagging. Okay, answer is bagging. Let us see what are the other methods available. The first one is sniffing. What is sniffing? The person is opening a container. He is having an inhalant in a container and he is directly inhaling the fumes from the container. That is called sniffing. Right? That is called sniffing. What is bagging? You take the inhalant in a paper bag or plastic bag and you can inhale it from the plastic bag. That is called bagging. It's very simple. Bagging. Sometimes what they do is they take a cloth, they pour this inhalant or volatile substance into the cloth. They keep on smelling from that. That is called huffing. Last year question. Huffing. Right. And the next one is ballooning. What is ballooning? You take a balloon, fill the balloon with the desired gas. The user is the person who's abusing, right? The person who's abusing is inhaling from the balloon. Commonly used gas is nitrous oxide. Okay, so that is called ballooning. And we have two more terminology. One is glading. What is glading? You take, this is commonly associated with room freshener. They will just spray the room freshener or any inhalant into the room and they keep inhaling the freshener from the room itself. That is called glading. Sometimes instead of spraying and indirectly inhaling, they will directly inhale the aerosol from the container itself. When they are inhaling from the container itself, that is called dusting. Okay, see, either this is a room freshener. If you are just spraying here, inhaling it, this is called glading. If you are directly inhaling the aerosols from it, this is called dusting. Okay, you are opening the container, inhaling the fumes from the container, that is called sniffing. Right, these are the common methods of inhalant abuse which you need to know. For students who are unable to touch the finish line, do not worry. The most certain way to succeed is always to try one more time. Okay, be persistent, identify your weak areas, work upon it. Wish you all success.